See, a discarded medical device left behind in an abandoned clinic became one of the most serious radiation accidents in history. Not inside a nuclear plant, not during a weapons test, but in the middle of a Brazilian city, handled by people who had no idea what they were holding. The Goiania accident of 1987 exposes a question that still matters. How does a source of ionizing radiation, carefully regulated, deliberately manufactured for a beneficial medical purpose, end up causing mass contamination simply because the systems meant to track it stopped working? The answer runs through institutional failure, missing paperwork, and a series of decisions made by people acting on reasonable assumptions that turned out to be catastrophically wrong. The device at the center of this event was a teletherapy unit, a type of medical equipment used in cancer treatment. These machines contain a sealed radioactive source, in this case cesium-137, positioned to deliver a precise beam of radiation to tumors. The physics is deliberate and controlled. The radioactive material is encased in heavy shielding, and the beam is directed only when the machine is in clinical use. When it is secured and maintained correctly, the source stays isolated from the outside world. The danger is not in the intended use, it is in what happens when the containment fails. The Instituto Goiano de Radioterapia in Goiânia, Brazil, had operated one such machine. By the mid-1980s, the clinic had become entangled in a legal dispute and relocated, leaving the teletherapy unit behind in the abandoned building. The unit was not decommissioned. It was not transferred to a licensed facility. Regulatory records concerning its final disposition were, at best, incomplete. The machine sat in the empty structure, unguarded. This is the overlooked assumption at the heart of the accident, that a sealed, shielded device left in place would remain sealed and shielded. What the assumption missed was human behavior in the absence of information. People who encountered an unfamiliar machine in an abandoned building had no way to know what it contained. In September 1987, two men entered the abandoned clinic and removed the rotating assembly of the teletherapy unit, intending to sell it as scrap metal. In the process of disassembling the device, the shielding around the cesium-137 source was breached. The capsule was eventually punctured. The cesium inside, a fine, highly soluble powder that glows a faint blue under certain conditions, became accessible. The glow was striking. To people with no training in radiation physics, a material that emits visible light in darkness reads as something extraordinary, even valuable or magical. The powder was handled, passed between people, brought into homes. A family allowed neighborhood children to play with it. The substance was rubbed on skin. Over several days, an expanding circle of people came into contact with a material that was actively irradiating everything it touched. The exposures ranged from external contact to ingestion. None of the people involved understood the mechanism of the harm they were accumulating. Symptoms began to appear: nausea, vomiting, swelling, skin lesions. Several people sought medical attention, but the constellation of symptoms was not immediately recognized as radiation sickness. One early medical assessment attributed the illness to an allergic reaction. Nearly 2 weeks passed between the initial breach and the moment a medical physicist, Lund Ney, correctly identified radiation exposure as the cause after a patient brought a sample of the contaminated material to a hospital. Once identification was made, the response escalated rapidly. Brazilian nuclear regulators, the Comissão Nacional de Energia Nuclear, deployed teams to assess the scope. What they found was a contamination problem that had spread across multiple private residences, vehicles, and public spaces throughout the city. Several sites required formal decontamination. Over 100,000 people were screened for exposure. Of those, more than 240 were found to have significant contamination. 4 people died as a direct result of radiation exposure, including a child who had been in close contact with the contaminated material. dozens required extended medical treatment for acute radiation syndrome. The human cost was concentrated among people who had no knowledge of the risk they were facing, a detail that sharpens the ethical dimensions of the failure considerably. The investigation that followed examined not just the events of September 1987, but the institutional chain that made them possible. The proximate cause was physical, the breach of the source capsule. But investigators and regulatory analysts traced the conditions backward through a series of systemic gaps. The teletherapy unit should never have been left unsecured in an unlicensed location. Licensing and regulatory frameworks for radioactive sources in Brazil at the time did not reliably ensure that sources were tracked from acquisition through decommissioning. The clinic's relocation and the legal dispute had effectively removed the device from the oversight system without triggering any intervention. No authority had confirmed the source's location or security after the clinic ceased operation. The gaps were not the product of deliberate concealment. They were the product of a regulatory architecture that had not closed the loop between point of installation and point of final disposal. This organizational layer is what distinguishes the Goiania accident from a simple equipment failure. The cesium-137 source did not escape because of a flaw in its original engineering. It escaped because the system designed to keep it accountable had no effective mechanism for handling orphan sources, radioactive materials that have left the custody of a licensed operator without being formally transferred or decommissioned. The concept of an orphan source became central to international nuclear safety reform in the years following Goiania. The International Atomic Energy Agency used the accident as a primary reference case when developing strengthened frameworks for source security and control. New guidance addressed the full life cycle of radioactive sources: manufacturing, transfer, use, storage, and disposal, with explicit requirements for tracking and for ensuring that no licensed source could simply fall out of the regulatory record. Brazil itself undertook substantial reform of its regulatory infrastructure. The accident accelerated the adoption of more rigorous national standards for source control and for the licensing of facilities that used sealed radioactive sources in medicine and industry. The practice of medical radiation therapy did not retreat. What changed was the architecture of accountability around the materials it required. The Goiania accident also shaped international thinking about how to communicate radiation risk to the public in emergency situations, a problem that is harder than it first appears. The people most exposed during the critical 2-week window were not ignoring warnings. They received none. The challenge of informing populations without triggering panic, while still enabling effective protective action, is one that emergency planners have continued to develop in the decades since. What makes the Goiania accident an enduring case study is precisely the absence of any single act of malice or negligence so obvious that it explains everything. The people who removed the machine were scavenging in what appeared to be an abandoned building. The families who handled the material were responding to something that looked remarkable. The early medical practitioners who saw the first patients were working from the information available to them. The regulatory system that failed to track the source had not been designed with the specific scenario of an abandoned clinic in mind. The failure was systemic, and its lesson is systemic. The danger of a radioactive source does not diminish when human attention moves elsewhere. The material remains what it is, regardless of whether anyone is watching. Safety, in this domain, cannot rely on the assumption that controlled conditions will persist on their own. It requires active, continuous accountability, a chain of custody that follows the source, not just the institution that once held it. That principle, drawn directly from what happened in Goiania, now underpins international standards for radioactive source management worldwide. Whether those standards are uniformly enforced is a separate, ongoing question, and it is one that regulators and public health agencies continue to answer facility by facility, country by country, year by year. This content is for educational purposes only. Do not attempt to recreate any described experiment or procedure.